Hello there, this is going to be the first installment of a two-part feature where we're going to be looking at the subject of witchcraft, its lore, its history, its origin, and we're really going to try to understand this subject in much broader ways than is commonly defined by the popular culture. And I wanted to make this not only because it's somewhat thematically applicable to the month that we're in October, but also because I think that the witch represents something even more applicable to the nature of this channel's subject, that of visually embodying the cultural and psychological history of human beings. I don't want to say too much about it too soon, but I do think that the witch represents something much deeper than as an icon of European folklore. It's a visual signifier of multiple strands of inquiry that reach deep into Europe's psychological, social and cultural history, and also its psycho-spiritual condition. And on the basis of that alone, it makes for an acceptable candidate for study, I think. So in this feature, we are going to try and set up and then dissect the archetype of the witch so that we can observe the various constituent parts that have informed it. And then in the second feature that will be arriving on Halloween next week, we are going to look deeper into the subjects of the heresies, the Inquisition phase of Europe's history, and then we'll be able to complete that whole analysis by placing our new understanding in accordance with the modern times that we're in today, and see how, in many ways, we've really not moved on from many of the old styles of thinking and patterns of judgment that courted the witch in the medieval period. So then, with all that being said, let's see what we can say about this phenomena of the witch. So to get things started off, let's say something about first appearances. One of the first things that immediately strikes you about subjects like this is how, after only a bit of deeper exploration, your perspective opens out into a much broader field of life than you originally imagined. It's like chipping away in a mine for gold, and then suddenly the wall gives way and you're exposed to a cavern of insights that previously remained hidden by our previously constrained perceptions. Studying the witch, studying a subject like the witch, is very much like that. On first appearances, we feel like we know the witch. We feel like in that familiar image, we've contained it. But as is always the case in these cultural subjects, there's always a lot more than meets the eye. And I want to continue to say something about the state that we're in when we try to unravel these kinds of phenomena. One of the most profound things about living in the times that we're in now is how we fail to realize the significance of our relationship to history and the mass accumulation of information. We live in a time where we have the libraries of Alexandria at our fingertips, and yet our appreciation of many things is often very surface level. We stand at this unique point in human history where we have access to this great mass of accumulated information, and yet our perception of prior peoples and the people and their lore and their culture is still so caricature driven. It's like we have the potential to be wise, but we stay watching Saturday morning cartoons, and so we have this understandably cartoon-like perception of culture and human history. And this is bolstered by the fact that our popular culture relays representations of the past, and to be quite honest, representations of contemporary subjects as well, in an all too caricature-driven way. We think of Rome and we hold Rome as a caricature in our minds, not as what it might have been like through an informed understanding. And even if we have done a bit of self-education on the subject's history, those characteristic impressions that have been relayed to us by the entertainment complex play into that education and disturb it, pollute it. This is a big part of the problem as to why perceptions about history and cultural subjects are so confused, and why there has to be so much revision in the West, because on the one hand, there is a lot of good information out there certainly is, but we're still haunted by the effects of long-held misconceptions about the past that have not been succeeded, and we continue to interface with impressions that, whilst being innocent from a purely artistic perspective, draw their life from a lot of the distortions that characterize our unsophisticated understanding of them. And I just want to say that I think that this caricature impression of other people and their history is not unique to us at all. I think that this was actually probably a lot worse in older times because of the lack of information access to most people. But what I'm really driving at here in this introduction is that the impressions of our time distort the way that we perceive history and the way we think about historical subjects, like the witch. We might think that we know history, but in reality, what we know is the impressions in our minds and not the subjects as they were in time. And I think it's just important to be aware of that. And this cultural distortion is as much applied to subjects like the witch as it is to subjects like ancient Rome. The witch has been tamed, pedestrianized, and repackaged as a trope within the annals of a consumerist machine. And this machine fumigates the cultural ecosystem with all of the reconstituted impressions that have been fed into it, meaning that whilst these reconstituted impressions still possess certain elements of historical truth to them, they're still predicated on certain elements of truth, they are still caricatures that are not to be taken for the things in and of themselves. These novelty expressions of the cultural machine haunt the palaces of our minds like ghosts, vaporous constructs that once spoke to a living form in history and now exist merely to serve a romantic satisfaction, a novel indulgence. We think we see the real history and the real mythos and the real lore in them, but in reality we see a reconstituted product, a ghost of what once was. But all's not lost to us, because the vestiges that occupy the body of the ghost still point to a deeper understanding, because, as I've just said, caricatures still embody essential elements of truth that direct us to deeper reservoirs of inquiry that can help to upgrade our perception and understanding to a more three-dimensional understanding and appreciation of what these things really are. And that kind of understanding is what I'm going to try and achieve with this feature on the Witches of Europe. I want us to start looking at these cultural tropes beyond the level of mere novelty and actually start to perceive them as the vestigial remnants of older systems that we can still learn about today. Through doing this, we can see cultural motifs as continuations of evolutionary imagery, lore, and intelligence reverberating throughout time from construct to construct, life to life, and mind to mind. And the witch is definitely part of such a historical continuum. The witch is not a singular entity, but a composite of various strands of information converging into a single impression. It's partly romantic, partly historical, partly political, religious. It's an expression of the European social psychology, and the witch is also an incubator of various heretical and subversive trends that occupied the European consciousness at various stages of its complex metamorphosis. And these are the details that we're going to unpack in this first feature. So from that small instance then, we can ascertain that our first impression about the witch is insubstantial to satisfy the true depth of material that can be found hiding beneath its uncanny frame. The witch can tell us a great deal about our historical legacy, but I think more importantly it can speak to something eternally pregnant within the psychology of the European. Something potent, creative, imaginative, but also something dangerous and intimidating to the popular perception, and something that can, as we'll see, lead to quite disastrous consequences. The witch is also an antagonist of the zeitgeist of the times, and is also to some a martyr to those that invoke its essence. And with these videos, it's that essence that I really want to try and capture in my rendering of the witches of Europe. Alright then, so let's begin by first outlining a general etymology and anatomy of the witch so that we can get an understanding of the general impression of what we're actually working with. There is a belief that the word witch has its origins in the Old Anglo-Saxon dialect. Some historians reason that the word is similar to witan, which means to know. This word also references the title of somebody who would advise the king on matters of import, so it pertains to a specialised knowledge. But there are other great researchers like Geoffrey Burton Russell who dismiss the source connection to the Anglo-Saxon and instead place its etymological origin further back towards an earlier Indo-European root to the word waik, which has its associations to religion and magical practices. And from this came words like wick, which pertains to sorcery and only then mutates into the later Anglo-Saxon tongue in words like Wicca, which describes a male sorcerer. So despite the debate around its original origins, we can still see that when we study the etymology, there are these strong associations to specialized knowledge and alternative religious practices, and those associations are still very much in place when we think about the witch today. We can also be certain that despite the possible origins in an earlier Indo-European root, the seed of the modern word was planted in the British Islands by the Anglo-Saxons when they came over. And they were originally pagan in disposition, which is something to bear in mind for when we talk about the religious subject later on. So the archetype of the witch, we could say, is held together by strands of association to specialized knowledge that is beyond the realms of common understanding, giving the witch this outsider quality. This outsider quality likely contributes to the suspect nature of the witch's activity and also sets it up later in an antagonistic position against the reigning orders of the day. So this means that because the church in medieval times was effectively both the spiritual and the political organ of medieval society, the witch is tied up in both religious interest and also in the developments of the social and political patterns that were occurring in Europe as well. I think that we can view the witch almost like a sponge that was absorbing a lot of the social disquiet and religious goings-on that was in the cultural atmosphere at the time. and it was compacted into a singular phenomena that symbolized that perturbance. This isn't to say that the phenomena of witchcraft is purely symbolic and people were not practicing alternative spiritual practices or getting up to unusual activities outside of the radar of the church's sites. What I am saying is that the witch is multifarious and speaks to religious, folk, and heretical social conditions that were going on in Europe in these parts of its history. And so now let's talk about some of those religious and cultural themes. So considering that this is really going to be an outline study into the phenomena of witches and the practice of witchcraft itself, we're going to have to skim over some quite broad reaches of time in our analysis, otherwise this thing would be about 7 hours long. And this is more of a concise overview of the phenomena in question. What I want to do now is give a bit of background insight into both the development of magic and European culture in the Middle Ages. We first have to start by trying to understand the practice of witchcraft within the ecosystem of a magical worldview. It would be foolish not to highlight this, considering that the centralizing force that informs the witch is the peculiar religious framework that it operates in. And I'm going to illustrate this using a Venn diagram taken from Geoffrey Burton Russell's incredible book on the subject called Witchcraft in the Middle Ages. So, as we can see, we have 4 major systems of religion, science, high magic, and low magic, with witchcraft occupying this territory in the religious sphere and bleeding into the spectrum of the low magic system. So what does this actually mean in simple terms? Well, the first thing that we have to qualify is that magic should not be considered, as it usually is in the popular perception, as an inferior system compared to religion or science, but as an independent worldview. Even though magic seems very fringe to us today, for the vast majority of our human gestation, magic was considered as an integrated part of the artistic, religious, and proto-scientific perspectives of earlier human civilizations, and the lines between these different sectors was a lot more blurred than it is today. When thinking about these systems in their original pre-modern distinction, we should see religion, sciences, the arts, and magical systems as individual technologies of the mind, each designed to, in some way, understand and harness the powers of the universe. So, returning back to our diagram, high magic, for example, was concerned with understanding the nature of reality through direct observational inquiry, merged with a ritualistic and creative component. Hence its overlap into both religion and science, as seen in the diagram. When we think of systems such as alchemy, for example, we can understand this as occupying a position of high magic because it is concerned with systematic analysis and inquiry, whilst also composing of a symbolic religious style of description as well. Low magic, on the other hand, is cruder in the sense that it's more practical and concerned with immediate effects as opposed to understanding the nature of the world. So when we think of practices such as sticking pins in a voodoo doll to cause injury to an individual, we're dealing with a system of low magic, and witchcraft in the medieval world was definitely more associated to this domain. We also have to say that the magical worldview is predicated upon this understanding that the cosmos is in man as much as man is in the cosmos. Therefore, the universe is seen to be a living thing, like an organism. This is naturally where we get the idea of the microcosm and the macrocosm, as above, so below, and statements like that. So we could also say that the cosmos is a reflection of what is in man, and vice versa, and the phenomena of the universe mesh with his own internals, his dreams, his desires, his fears, into a complete holistic system. The magical worldview places man at the centre of the universe, even more so than either religion or science, and it posits that with the correct knowledge, man can dynamically steer the patterns of nature to his will, thus contributing to his own ascent or descent for that matter. So there's this idea that man and the cosmos exist together in a synergistic relationship, and man's potential as a sentient organism in that space is unlimited. He can command the powers of nature to his will, and this had a significant impact on the thinkers of the Renaissance. There are features of overlap between the systems of high and low magic practices, however, these being in the areas of divination and also in the conjuration of spirits to aid the individual with a particular problem. And we can see these styles of process in action when it comes to medieval witchcraft. Christianity would take a very different stance to these things, however, because in their eyes, by trying to compel the powers of the creation via supernatural means, man was setting himself against the creator, and therefore this makes magic a heretical belief system. So the Christians did not deny the existence of magic. They didn't pretend like it didn't exist. They did believe that it existed. But to the very idea of man controlling nature through supernatural means or conjuring spirits, this was totally off limits to that. It should be made clear that the European Christians didn't distinguish either between high and low magic, or the individual intent of the practitioner either. Some members of the church were aware of a distinction in practice and intent, but nonetheless, this was always considered a devious activity from the Christian cosmological conception, and we will see how these things all played out a bit later on. So witchcraft operates in the territories of lower magical systems, and there's no operandi in place to say whether its practice is for benevolent or malevolent purposes. Quite often it was pursued by individual people for both ends. So now let's take into consideration the metamorphosis that Europe had gone through in the transition between paganism and Christianity, and combine this with what we've already gone over with regards to magical systems. As we all know, Europe was eventually Christianized, meaning that prior to its Christianization that there was another belief system in place, and this we would understand as pointing to an origin religion specific to the European people that we casually put under the umbrella of what we call paganism. Now, I don't think that it's necessary to go into some big back history over the particulars of paganism, because I think that would be outside the reach of this video's central theme. It is, however, necessary to consider certain aspects of the transition from paganism to the new Christian order. As many of us know, Christianity is not a pure system in the sense that its defining characteristics were not originated completely from itself, let's say. It, like the witch, is a composite religious system, as many of them are. It incorporates aspects of Greco-Roman philosophy, Judaic and Near Eastern law and morality, and also, for our interest, also aspects of the pagan systems in Europe that it eventually superseded. But for the time being, let's just bear in mind that Europe was by no means a monocultural entity in the Middle Ages. In fact, as I've just said, it was very much like the witch itself. It was a hybrid that drew of various strands of philosophical, theological, and traditional informers to inform the body of its dynamic. Christianity had absorbed features of the Greco-Roman religion into its form, and also swallowed elements of the Teutonic branches that complemented certain aspects of what the Christians were trying to accomplish within their own system. Here's this, though. Out of all of the pagan deities and practices, it was the chthonic deities that preserved the longest, because the worship of those deities was usually more private and individually driven and away from the main temple spaces in those cultures, meaning that the proliferation of these cults and practices could live on under the radar, so to speak, for much longer periods of time after the Christian colonization, and they could therefore evade a lot of the efforts of suppression and continue to germinate even long after Europe had been Christianized. And that's something serious to take into consideration when we understand that medieval society subsisted on agriculture and the hunt, where contact with the areas outside of the peripheries of the towns and the cities still contained a lot of this residual religious life that may have certainly contributed to the phenomena of witchcraft. These are chthonic deities and practices, meaning that they have a terrestrial and underworld nature to them. And it became very easy for Christianity to demonize, literally, these outsider practices due to their association with the fertility gods of the earth and of the crop and of the chthonic forces of nature. So simply because Christianity became the officially sanctioned religion of the day, didn't mean that many of the traditional and folk customs that had preceded it just vanished overnight. In fact, many of these practices and beliefs lived on well into the Middle Ages and intermingled with the attentions of the Christian high order. So, for example, even though in medieval Britain Christianity was the reigning religious order of the day, you still had a lot of old folk festival and folk activity that was still going on at the same time as the populace was Christianized. It's a really strange thing to think about, but this was actually what was going on. It wasn't the case that Christianity just ruled supreme. It was the official sanctioned religion. But things didn't just change overnight. These long-held, generation-long traditions and practices, they don't just vanish overnight, and they were legion. There were all kinds of different things that were going on all over Europe, and it took a very, very long time to fully either suppress or assimilate a lot of those things. So despite the fact that many of the newly Christianized members still partook of these traditions, for a while the church reluctantly tolerated them because they were a part of what held the public consciousness together, and also because of the difficulties, I think, in regulating these things. It took a while to get a lot of that stuff organized, and of course what the consequences might have been to public order if they tried to suppress and banish all of these folk customs in one blow. It was better to let people have a bit of their own thing going on and still demand that they remained obedient to the Christian doctrine for the time being. And a good example of what I wanted to mention about one of these controversial folk festivals that raised a few eyebrows from the church was a yearly activity known as the Feast of Fools. This was a practice that was held between Christmas and Epiphany, and this was essentially an orgy of licentious reveling and feasting that represented a return to chaos after the winter solstice, where a rejuvenating pattern of life emerges from the period of death and brings about the world reborn. This is also similar to the Roman practice of the Saturnalia, which likewise symbolized a rite of cosmic revival. We also hear in Northern Europe where there were even instances of Paleolithic rites designed to amplify the supply of beasts for the hunt in the coming year, and this necessitated the wearing of furs and animal masks, where people would temporarily pretend to be beasts in order to activate their yield, almost like a case of sympathetic magic. There are still practices similar to this today that occur in the same time span that we're talking about between December and spring. Men from rural areas in Europe don these incredible costumes made of animal furs and dance about the countryside making a commotion. And this is typically done in the name of fertility and yields, like the Paleolithic rite that I was just on about. And there's this one here where we've got these large phallic-shaped costumes to them, and the idea is that women will playfully brush up against these man beasts and make themselves fertile for the spring. So that's something quite interesting. So merely from this, we can tell that some of these old customs have not faded away from the European mind, and they still hold a sway over our folk psychology that justifies their continual reenactment. Much was the same case in medieval Europe, because we have to remind ourselves of the significance that the major festivals and customs, however Christianized, still held a lot of their pagan significance in the minds of those people, I think to a far more prominent effect than we can really appreciate today. You can change a major religion, but all of that folk memory and that folk psychology and the impressions of the older order of things still germinate within the human system. And it was the prominence of this effect that gave rise to the early conditions for witchcraft to emerge. And these festivals are important to our consideration of the witch, because whilst they obviously pointed to the rites of older periods in Europe's history, the characteristics of revelry, dancing, excess, nature, fertility, and the addition of animal disguises all contribute to a connection with the witch phenomena. So when we look into the history, there's definitely this confluence between some of the older motifs of European pagan rites, folk psychology, the reigning order of Christianity, and the practice of witchcraft. And I just want to relay a few more of those things to you now. The common motif of the witch flying through the air on a broomstick is very common across multiple cultures, not just Europe. There are actually instances of Hindu witches who fly naked through the air and consume the flesh of men at night, for example. Cannibalism and the eating of raw flesh, human flesh, including the flesh of infants, does show up readily in reports of medieval witchcraft. However, the eating of infants does occur far more frequently in the European instances. Flesh eating and the sacrificial aspect of certain reported rites were one of the things that most repulsed the Christians, as it re-invoked the times when their forebears were persecuted at the hands of pagan emperors and forced to eat the sacrificial meats. And it only contributes to the successive demonization of the old customs and the enthusiasm committed to suppressing them by force. The implementation of the Bible in witchcraft ceremonies is also telling, where the Bible would sometimes be opened at random and recited backwards, likely as a ritualization of those individuals' contempt towards the reigning superstructures of their time. And when you really think about it, these rebellious acts that seek to mock or assault the image of the high order, they still go on today in modern political protest. If we look at it purely through an anthropological lens, the donning of masks that gruesomely imitate political leaders or the torching of flags can be seen, I think, under a similar light. We make efforts to symbolize our internalized feelings about the world that we're in. They are a part and a parcel of our symbolic expression that never leaves us. Also, we have the strong association to nature and animals in the witch motif. Witches can call upon animals to do their bidding so that they can speak the languages of nature, which again lends to a heretical aspect because this would have been believed to have been acquired by diabolic means. I can't remember which Christian father said it now, but it was something to the effect of nature is the devil's church, something like that, and it just reminded me of it. The colours green and black also associated with the witch also speaks to this. Green was a colour back then associated with fairies and the woods, so it's got that supernatural folk component to it. Black, of course, representing nighttime and the time when witches would meet under the cover of darkness to perform their rites. In connection to this, I also want to lastly include the medieval phenomena of the wild man or hag in the woods, who is a composite of the old Teutonic tradition of the Wilderjagd, I think that's how you pronounce it, in the German, where we hear about a procession of wild beings led by a spirit that would romp through the countryside, reveling, again, devastating and killing anything that crossed its way, almost like a tornado. And the descriptions of the leader of this procession vary from account to account, though it's typically associated with vegetation and nature, and it can be either female or male. However, it commonly comes up as a female, and I think that that's a very important thing to notice, because these wild men of medieval folklore were very satyr-like. They were always associated with animal brutality and eroticism, which was the perfect vessel to capture the repressed libidinal mechanisms of early medieval man. His counterpart, the wild woman, was a murderess, a spirit transformed into the shape of a hag that came out in the night and partook of cannibalism, sexual debauch, and it's these archetypes, these expressions of folk psychology that I think were the prototypes of what eventually became our witch. What we're looking at here is a gradual humanization of the chthonic spirit, something that was perhaps in a previous order of its life more spiritual and metaphysical in nature, but which had now finally condensed into the image of a human being. And that is the metamorphosis that I believe has happened to the witch. It is previously a chthonic enterprise of paganistic and folk custom that has manifested itself in the form of a flesh and blood person. So here's what we're really looking at. Let's summarize this. An emanation of chthonic worship succeeding the Christianization of the pagan world. The persistence of low magic systems practiced beyond the immediate ranges of the state's vision. Folk psychology and a connection to the world of agriculture, fertility, and the hunt. And also the prevalence of a social antagonism against the ruling superstructures of the medieval world. These are the four wombs, I would say, that have given birth to the composite phenomenon that we call the witch. And I've tried to give a concise enough overview of these domains so that we can truly see the various factors that are coming in and informing this contemporary phenomenon. In the next video that will, as I said, it's going to arrive appropriately on Halloween, we're going to be delving a lot deeper into the questions of heresy and also the circumstances that helped to shape it and the dire consequences that led to the deaths of thousands of Europeans in the medieval age. So then, I hope that you've enjoyed my own analysis on the phenomena of the witch. There is a lot of material to go in with this. If you want one book to read on witchcraft, I can only recommend this one to you. This is absolutely brilliant. It's called Witchcraft in the Middle Ages by Geoffrey Burton Russell. I've also got another book by Russell on the shelf there to do with Satan and the nature of evil. But if you're interested in witchcraft, this is the one to get. This is no nonsense. It's very detail packed, and also it's reasonably accessible as well. I quite enjoyed reading it, a lot more than I thought I was going to, actually, and it's been very helpful to go through this and look at all of the notes that I made about it to bring into this video for you here. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it's given you a bit of an understanding on the anatomy of the witch, and like I said, in the next one, the follow-up one, it's going to be a bit more serious, it's going to be a bit darker, believe it or not, than this one. Because we're going to be talking about some very uncomfortable things that were going on in Europe to people at that particular time. So I won't keep you any longer, and yeah, I'll see you again.